Let me welcome you all to Massey College virtually and invite you to this very special session that we wanted to organize on taking stock of what we had done, the educational program that was run by Rosemary McCartney and Diane Sachs for the last year and a half on climate change, climate adaptation. But let me first recognize that Massey College, where I'm speaking from, is on Indigenous lands, the lands that have been inhabited by Indigenous people for thousands of years, the Yonwanda, the Seneca, the Onishomi, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. It is the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and I want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward this land, as well as the great privilege that we have to continue to do our work here. So in 2020, everybody was preparing to go to Glasgow, and suddenly COVID hit and we were in limbo. So at Massey College, we decided that this postponement of the Glasgow meeting offered an opportunity to learn and thanks to Rosemary and Diane, we had a very diverse range of climate change issues, from finance to the arts, diplomacy, intergenerational activism, economics, healthcare, and so on. A truly Massey event, a true interdisciplinary look at what climate change means and will mean. So we had webinars, we had speakers, taking advantage of the fact that we had to do it online. We had speakers from all over the world speaking about a variety of issues relating to climate change. And we actually had a compendium that was made of what was done. So I'm just very grateful. Alyssa, if you just want to show the first page, it's going to be put on our website. I hope that it was distributed to you. And the second part today, I think what we want to do is, now what? What are we going to do next and what's needed? So this session is divided into two parts. The first part we'll hear from our three panelists that I'll introduce in a few minutes. And the second part will be question and answer, a little bit of strategy thinking with you. We also have surveyed the junior fellowship and we'll share the result of that survey. I have to say, we invited you, it's a closed meeting. We invited you to hear what you had to say, your advice on where Massey should go. And therefore, it was not meant to be an open meeting. It really is a limited list of people that were invited, trying to represent different constituencies. But it's not the only meeting that we'll hold for sure. And I'm hoping that we'll see how it goes today. And if we need to have more meetings to kind of drill down a little bit how far we can go, certainly I think it's the intentions that we continue. So let me first introduce our panelists. Three women that I have looked to for advice and leadership on this question. And first we'll hear from Her Honor, the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, Elizabeth Dalzell, who's had a long career at the heart of climate matters. And I hope that she'll be able to share her great wisdom. She's also is the honorary patron of Massey College. I want to thank her and for that patronage, and I want to welcome her again to Massey. It's such an honor to have you here, Your Honor. So as you all know, she's held various positions in the federal public service, and eventually she worked for the United Nations Environmental Program in Nairobi, Kenya. So she's well versed in what we're talking about today. And then we'll hear from Rosemary McCartney, who joined Massey College following her role as Canadian Ambassador to the United Nations. And she became Massey's Senior Fellow in Foreign and Defense Policy and is our diplomat in residence. And so thank you very much, Rosemary, for joining us. And then we'll have Diane Sachs, who's well known as well in this community. She is a senior fellow at Massey College, and she was Ontario's most recent environmental commissioner. So thank you all three. Let me just begin with you, Lieutenant Governor. You've been part of international discussions, debates, and summits on the environment and climate change. What have you learned, and how are you thinking about what needs to be done and how to affect change?
Thanks very much, Natalie, and how delighted I am to be back at Massey College, particularly to engage with some junior fellows. So I hope, first of all, that you're all well. Congratulations on the initiative that you took this past year to explore all of the issues. I've had a look at the compendium, and I'm amazed at the breadth that it displays of what climate change is all about. And you put a lie to the fact that it's simply an environmental issue. It is, of course, so much more than that. And I'm sure that that is what you came up with. I loved the title of the series, and I was very envious as well. In fact, I too was absent from COP26 when one of the most senior attendees, who shall remain nameless, came back. The first thing I asked him was, or told him, that I was having withdrawal pains, missing the energy of COPs, the camaraderie, and the real sense of purpose that meetings like that usually have. It's an exciting place to be. So you ask a question about affecting change and mobilizing for change, and I have a short answer, but I have a more wandering answer. And let me just take a few minutes to wander, because my introduction to this issue of climate change actually happened in the late 80s, 88 thereabouts, into the early 90s, and it was a reflection of the science first and foremost. At that time, I was head of the Canadian Weather Service, and so climate change was the issue of the day. And I served as Canada's representative on the IPCC and on their executive committee. So I ended up chairing a lot of the meetings. And then, of course, one late night, 3 o'clock in the morning, the international community decided we now knew enough and we had to move to negotiations. And that's when the International Negotiating Committee was set up, and ultimately led to the Framework Convention on Climate Change being taken to the Rio Conference in 1992. I reflect on that time for just a moment because it was, first of all, a period of absolutely intense learning, science and research, certainly through the IPCC, but there was also the need to develop a whole new vocabulary. What on earth were we talking about, and how were we talking about it? And so the issue of how to communicate in a compelling way became very much a part of the process, because we were all wanting to build a constituency and build common cause. And ultimately, that was the start of the COP process. I'll never forget understanding that it was such a perverse public policy challenge. We were talking about, although we didn't use the words at the time, talking about the decarbonization of our lives, unprecedented scope and complexity, because it affected every part of the way we live. Growth and development, peace and security, energy and trade, all of those issues that you've looked at. It was also a time when it was very much decision-making in the face of uncertainty. So how far could you go, calling it the precautionary principle, but how far could you start down the track without having all of the information at hand? And then, of course, it was an issue of global interdependence. No one country, no one jurisdiction could solve anything on their own. And so in understanding that, we also became exposed to amazing and profound questions of equity. So that's the past. And I say that because you're thinking about COP26. So although I was not there, and although I cannot pass judgment, I can tell you what I hear and what I see. 26 years later, we've got some better science, some more definitive science, certainly greater precision. And I could go into that, but you don't want to hear about precipitation and patterns and the difference between weather and climate and all of those kind of things. But we've seen new technologies, certainly in the field of clean energy. And we've seen some steps forward. At COP26, there were pledges to cap emissions, coal phase out, putting a price on carbon, commitments to net zero, reduction of methane, deforestation, food security, international aid. All of those things were touched upon and commitments and pledges made. One of the things that I saw, and one of the things that people told me, was that essentially what made COP26 different was that people actually believed that climate change was real. Most of the COPs until this point in time have also had a good membership of people who were questioning whether it was real or not. So this was the first one where that really was not an issue. The public opinion research that came out at the time and since shows overwhelming numbers of the public believing and also supporting as well. And I think for the first time, there was a much better understanding of adaptation, not just mitigation. So those are just a quick overview of what I heard coming out of COP26, but I also heard some questions. So is there enough urgency? Are we running out of time? Did we move beyond good intentions? Were the steps bold and ambitious enough? What are the real mechanisms for accountability? And finally, and the one that I keep coming back to, do we really understand what drives attitudinal and behavioral change, both in individuals and in governance and our institutions? I'll stop there for 1 minute, but I want to transition to the world we've been living in, and that's the pandemic. And I do that because coincident with this focus on climate change has been the experience of our one other really global crisis, and that is the pandemic. In this position, I have such a wonderful opportunity to reach out to people all over the province and to ask them very directly how they're doing. And as you might imagine, through hundreds of those conversations, I've heard some poignant stories of grief and loss, but I've also heard amazing stories of inspiration. People collaborating, exhibiting creativity, courage, building community, adapting, and in many ways, stories, compelling stories of anxiety and hope in equal measure. So I wanted to mention 5 insights or observations to you. And I do so because I think there are lessons to be learned. And I think one of the things that you might consider doing is actually saying, what can we take from what we've observed during a pandemic that might be applicable to really making progress on climate change? So, and these are not the only ones, but they're ones that I think are important. The first one is collaboration amongst all orders of government. Now, that may not be as true now as it was at the start of the pandemic, but the number of people who would say to me automatically, isn't it wonderful to see government working together? That was amazing. And the part of that also was a real coming to recognition of how important municipal government is. The fact that that's where it's the level we forget about, and yet it's closest to people, the level where we get things done. So that was number 1. The second one, a real evidence of trust and confidence in science, particularly at the beginning. I mean, this was real evidence-based decision-making, and what environmentalist hasn't cried for years about having real evidence-based decision-making? But the other thing that I think we also learned was that people don't know how science works. and they got really frustrated when the ground rules changed. So in other words, scientists know that as soon as you get new information, then the observations change, the conclusions change, and you, of course, have different responses. So that was somewhat frustrating, but it also emphasized again the absolute need for solid communications. People who communicate well, who are articulate, are so in demand if we're going to make real progress. Thirdly, it was a vivid illustration of our interconnectedness. And of course, that underscored our mutual vulnerability. When I say interconnectedness, I mean things like all of a sudden we realized the lack of security of our supply chains, for example. But we also realized that we're not going to solve this issue unless we vaccinate the whole world. And that, of course, the issue of equity is one that's still front and center. But I also think closer to home that the interdependence became so obvious when we looked at a healthcare system, for example, that didn't include older care. I think for the first time that I can remember, we've actually seen that the separation of an economic sector and a social sector is a bit of a misnomer. For the first time, we now have the economic sector aware and saying so that we have to deal with women's issues, what used to be called women's issues like childcare. Otherwise, we weren't going to get back to the kind of prosperity we wanted. Number 4, I think we would all agree that we have really exposed the fundamental questions of inequity and inequalities. There is no vaccine for poverty, for homelessness, for the hunger. And those are issues that are going to haunt us. And finally, as there is just an unmistakable desire for normalcy. And as we rush back to normal, we hear people more and more talking about a better normal. And the question on my mind is the difficulty of managing the transition. Will we embrace the lessons that we've learned? Will we have those respectful conversations about who matters and what matters? I'm not sure that we have the mechanisms in place, notwithstanding all the Zoom calls with well-intentioned people around the table. We often don't have the people around the table. And we certainly, as yet, don't have a good understanding of those who aren't interested, who don't believe, and who don't think they matter. So I relate these insights from past and present. Some of them haven't really changed very much over 26 years. But this pandemic has really brought them so close to home into everybody's household. And I think there's a wonderful opportunity to really think about what lessons are applicable to the crisis of climate change. And that's what I hope you might explore during the second part of our conversation. So the short answer, and then I'll stop talking altogether. But let me just say that renewal, recovery, reset, all start with listening. Genuine and respectful engagement. It starts with commitment and intentionality and accountability. And ultimately, I think it's going to mean understanding that we only make progress at the speed of trust. And that's really the bottom line. So, sorry, a long answer to a short question, but I hope that might provide some fodder for the second half of the conversation.
I cannot thank you enough. Yeah, we can only work at the speed of trust. What a wonderful way of summarizing the. Thank you so much. That I think I took lots of notes. I think we're on to a very good start and lots of reflections here. I think for all of us, not only in this for our climate change, but more generally, I think about the way in which we may proceed on other issues as well. Let me now move to Diane. Maybe you are very much involved in the local aspects of climate change and the importance of action and policy movement. What did the last year reveal for you in terms of the critical role that the honors highlighted as well of local governments in creating momentum for change?
Well, thank you. And of course, the Lieutenant Governor has already touched on a number of the points I wanted to make. But when I was commissioner, I spent a lot of time talking to people who felt really discouraged that they knew what municipal government should be doing and couldn't get buy-in from the council. And what I encouraged them to do was to do the work anyway, to do the research, to prepare the plans, to take them to the council. And even if they got rejected, even if they got rejected over and over again, to have them ready, because we might not know what disaster is coming, but we know that disasters are coming. And when a disaster comes, suddenly politicians, businesses are scrambling around looking to do something and to do something quickly. And Naomi Klein described this in her book about shock capitalism, and we certainly have many terrible examples of disasters being used as excuses for environmentally and humanly destructive activity. And I can think of a long list of those in Ontario right at the moment, but yeah, given that her honor is here, I'm not going to mention. But when the moment comes, when the crack comes, if the work has been done, if the plans are ready, then municipal government in particular can move very quickly. And we saw some very good examples of that, I think, at the municipal level in the last year. The biggest, most obvious example is the use of road space. So roads have been the empire of the car. And, in Toronto, we had all this nonsense about war on the car. And activists, communities have been working together for many, many years, arguing for more use of road space for people, less for cars. And we got, by and large, nowhere. But because of all of that work, when COVID came, then suddenly when the city was very desperate looking for things to do, then we saw Cafe Tio, we saw the cafes on the street, which turns out people love. It's a wonderful, okay, maybe not in January, but it's a wonderful way to participate in the city. We saw dedicated bus lanes rolled out, which have been asked for and asked for and asked for, gosh, for most of my career. We've seen this huge upsurge in bike lanes and an explosion in demand because we've had this very large pent-up demand for biking that hasn't been realized because there's been no safe way to bicycle. So the city controls public space and could very quickly say, okay, we're having cafes there, we're having bike lanes here, we're having bus lanes there. And it worked beautifully and it made things better for most people really quickly. And we could do a lot more of that. So that's one big thing. A second big thing that we've seen happen, and again, this is based on many years of collaboration and activism and academics and hard work that just seem to never get anywhere. And it's the role of equity, right? The disproportionate impact of COVID and climate on the vulnerable. We had two events focusing particularly on Black voices in climate action in, I think, Black History Month last year, and we had the Indigenous voices in climate action. But we really have seen attention being paid to the fact that climate and environmental destruction exacerbates inequality, but also that unless we find a way to bring everyone along, we're not going to be able to get the political support for the action that we need. And so more attention to equity, more attention to the impact on inequality, both of climate action and the failure to take action. That was something I was really glad to see movement on in the last year or two that we just hadn't seen before. There's some interesting psychological theories about what that might have happened. We see that in Transform TO and so on. A third thing that I have really noticed is a more general understanding, not everywhere by any means, but a more general understanding that sprawl is Ontario's oil sands. It is the largest driver of our climate destruction. It's the largest driver of our environmental destruction. It's one of the largest drivers of the cost issues for municipalities, drives up taxes and so on. And that it's not necessary. It is not a good answer to housing affordability issues. And so I was really proud of the council in Hamilton who pushed back against the sprawl narrative being forced down their throat by the Ford government and by the development industry. And, partly as a result of some talks I gave, but mostly a result of local organizing of lots of people, admittedly a lot of women, taking leadership and speaking up and pushing back. And so Hamilton turned down the giant sprawl narrative that's been successful in so many other places in December, and that same fight's going on right now in Halton. Would that have happened without COVID? I'm not sure. So, we've still got a really long way to go, but at least we have learned, we've got lots of good examples now that cracks will occur. John Robinson says this a lot, that it seems as if we're battling against intact, impenetrable institutions that we can't get anywhere. But in fact, their foundations are shattered and the cracks will come. And when the cracks come, if the work's been done, the intellectual work's been done, the organizing work's been done, the planning's been done, and can have those ready to go, big changes can happen.
Well, thank you, Diane. And so we have some similarities here: local, municipal role, the role of equity, the pay attention to equity, and I think we'll let's hear now from Rosemary, and then we'll move to including the crowd here. So, Rosemary.
Thanks so much, Natalie, and hello to the Lieutenant Governor and my colleague Diane and everyone at Massey. You had asked me to speak a little bit about what we did this year with Massey's Missing COP26 from the point of view of, the intergenerational dialogue that's required in climate action and climate change as we transition from these 12 series event to what are we going to do about it? And it's such an easy thing at Massey. We designed these series to be intergenerational because we're asked to be about, we want to make sure we include all voices. And sometimes when we think about that, we think about it from the point of view of voices not often at the table, but we forget that there's this intergenerational side that's so fundamentally important. And Massey is it's always been part of the heart and soul of Massey about an intergenerational dialogue on most issues. So what I really liked about what we were able to accomplish and why it kind of set the table for where we need to go next was, we looked at, for example, one of our young youth activists in Canada who's so well known, Sophia Martour, and she said, we can't just say we're in a climate crisis, and we can't just say, oh, I've learned a lot about climate change, or I believe in climate justice. She said, no, that's not good enough. We can't just say it. We have to actually do something about it, and we can't just do little things. We have to do big things, and we have to do the hard things. And this was a voice of a 12, 13-year-old young woman from Northern Ontario. And, I took what she said to heart, but, within a week or two, we were talking to two Canadian icons, Lloyd Axworthy and David Suzuki. So between the two of them, 50 years of activism, and you put them together and you've got a century of Canadian activism on the issues that matter to this country. And they both said effectively the same thing, that the change that has to take place on climate has to be big. It has to be large scale, it has to be broad, and it has to be about a public movement. And they use the language of movement, which I thought was terrific. And, thinking of Sophia and then thinking of Lloyd and David, and they said you can use that power, use the power of coming together, use the power of voting, use the power of joined up action. And I've spent a lot of my life on the global side of things, a little bit like the Lieutenant Governor, but I think where Diane is coming from is so true. And one of our junior fellows, Rocher said in one of the series, he said, and I wrote it down, he said, that you have to bring global diplomacy, which is essential, but you've got to bring it home, because real diplomacy is local first. And I just thought that just tied it all so beautifully together. So when we put this series together, we were going up, we were going down, we were going across, we were going around the 360-degree circle, including, you know, our financial leadership in this country. You know, two amazing CEOs of two of the banks talking about how they're flipping their risk-reward assessments on their heads and listening to the future and where things need to go, and making really tough, hard changes across billions of dollars of portfolios. And that's also at scale. They're not tweaking at the edges, they're doing massive things. And then finally, just to bring it back to the question, Natalie, you raised it, the Lieutenant Governor and Diane, is that this pandemic that we're in, we did a session on climate change and health. And it wasn't about the pandemic, it was on climate change and health, but the pandemic kept coming up in those discussions and conversations because it has laid bare the inequities. You know, this pandemic has laid bare the inequities that underlie. And so when we talk about climate justice, we have to talk about justice in its broadest sense. And that intergenerational conversations we're having, it gives us the broadest lens of looking back to Lloyd and David Suzuki and learn the lessons of the past, and then look forward well with optimism, but also with determination. And I love what the Lieutenant Governor said about purposeful, intentional, and respectful. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary. Let's move to what can Massey do? I think, so, you know, just focus on what Massey is all about. It's certainly about empowering the junior fellows to be the fabulous leaders that they already are, and that will continue to be PhDs, masters, law degrees, medical degrees. So they will have positions of responsibility in our society. So we always take the learning, the collective learning, very seriously. So I think there probably are still issues that need to be addressed. The Lieutenant Governor mentioned a couple of things about how do we know what motivates people collectively or individually. So that may be something, but other things, Massey has a role as well. It's an institution itself, so it probably has other roles. Can I just ask you just one round among the three of us about what would you like and what do you think Massey should do? Let me start with you, our honorary patron, the Lieutenant Governor.
I'm not supposed to be prescribing action for anybody in this particular role, but you know, it's obvious that you start by understanding your own impact, both as an organization and as individuals. So probably people have already done this. What is your carbon footprint, for example, in your own organization? And then I think a learning institution is also a place that can bring people together. Mm-hmm. And so when I talk about no mechanisms for having that interdisciplinary conversation, for example, that is something that Massey does so well, mm-hmm. and can continue to do as we make progress, mm-hmm. As we look at solutions going forward. And the third thing I would say is that I hope that you maintain the opportunity to do interdisciplinary work, because the complexity of this issue just doesn't fit into our standard disciplines. And I'm particularly respectful of the role of the arts. Yeah. And you know, who can tell a story better than David Attenborough, for example? Who can write about, who can do the photography from the Lytton fires this summer? I mean, how to explain a heat dome, how to explain the immediacy of the issue. And so through poetry, through music, through film, all of those kind of things are all things that fit so nicely within Massey's wheelhouse.
Yeah, I forgot to mention, I mean, part of the compendium was really much about reaching out to the arts, involving the artist's voice, which I think well, I love. It's not only, but it's so meaningful and empowering, and inspires us to just kind of continue to do our work. And we have many artists at Massey, so they are part of that conversation. So Diane, what's my to-do list from your perspective?
Well, I mean, I agree, of course, with the Lieutenant Governor. The first thing is to do what the Massey can do, so your own footprint.
Mhm.
I know in the survey there was some conversation about the building. The building's important. I would start though with food. You know, the meals are a big deal at Massey, and quite understandably. And food has an enormous carbon for food, and food waste has an enormous carbon footprint. And so food choices, being really transparent about food is a good place to start. Another thing to think about is transportation. So, you know, you could have a couple of e-bikes that residents could use. You could think about be a visible leader is the first thing. But what's much more important is to work for collective action. We know that climate change cannot be solved by individual action, not by individuals and not by organizations. But, you know, what is Massey's strength? Massey's strength in intergenerational advocacy across silos. Well, that seems to me to be an area where there is still a huge gap. And two things that occurred to me that you have in particular, in addition to just the incredibly high quality of people that you have in both your junior and senior fellows, you got the Royal Chapel. So you have this special link with First Nations. And we know that integrating reconciliation and climate action are incredibly important on all kinds of fronts. Here's one really simple example. Decarbonizing Ontario means electrification. That means transmission lines. That means crossing Indigenous lands. And that's not going to happen without Indigenous support. So that's just a really simple, concrete example where no one is leading those conversations. And yet we know we have to do it. So finding a way to really lead on those conversations would be great. A second thing that occurred to me is, you know, you have that beautiful round room. It's one of the most lovely rooms I've ever seen for small group conversations in a fairly private place. So there's a lot of practical obstacles now, like how do we actually do X, not the why or even the who, but the how, that are getting balled up. So you look at Transform TO and they've got all kinds of great ideas, but a lot of them, they're just saying, well, you know, we'll explore, we'll talk about this. That way they're not actually doing things. And so if you had an opportunity to use the physical space you have, which is in a great location, and the people that you have to get some of those really focused solutions conversations happening, and you can afford to do it without public acclaim, right? You can do it quietly. And that's another thing that's really useful is there a quiet way to have important conversations with the kind of skills that Rosemary has to attack obstacles and see some movement? Those would be great things I'd love to see Massey do.
So Rosemary, do you want to talk about the survey? But I want to hear your list of suggestions. And I want people really in the audience start chiming in. You know, if you put them in the chat, I'll spotlight you, and then you can make your contribution. Rosemary.
Oh, well, thanks, Natalie. I think everyone at Massey, junior fellows, senior fellows, the quadrangle group, everyone has a role and can do something. There was one thing I saw in the survey, the use of the language climate change literacy. And so we've done this 12 series, but there was, a request that we need to do more of that. So I was thinking, can we take the compendium, which is so rich, and the hot links, and actually break it down into, okay, now what would we do about that? And what can Massey do about that? So that's a possibility. The second thing is, I think I like the Lieutenant Governor, there are lessons of this pandemic that we need to extract and put under the lens of climate change, because a crisis can mobilize, which is great, and it can create solidarity, which is great, but it can also leave people behind, isolated, and a society divided onto itself. So what are the lessons that we can learn from this pandemic we're still in and apply to climate change? And the third one is politicians. So we're going to have a provincial election in the coming year. Massey, as Diane has said, we're so well situated with our physical plant and our reputation. We could host an all leaders debate on climate change. We could host all candidates debate for whoever the candidates are going to be that were in their constituency around climate change. I think that would be a huge contribution, and we can, get our names in on that very quickly. And then the last thing I would say just quickly is the arts. When Minister Guilbeault was here, our climate change minister, he said, yes, facts, yes, science, but let's not forget the art, because music and the arts express even more forcefully the climate crisis to individuals. It speaks to individuals, and movements have always had music. I mean, so whether we were talking about anti-war movement or the anti-poverty movement or the anti-apartheid movement and so on, I think of music. They all had anthems, didn't they, that we can probably still sing. But you think about them and the artists associated with them, and Massey is full of poets and authors and musicians and singers. It's such a rich community. And so music and the arts can become a force multiplier in motivating and creating and building inspired community. So, history is most powerfully remembered through the stories and the poetry and the music. And I think Massey's so well situated to take advantage of that.
Well, thank you. So I'm want to open it up, but as you warm up to ask your questions or make suggestions, let's go through the slide just so you get a sense of some of the suggestions that came from the survey. So climate action at Massey, here's what people said: need to green the campus, and retrofitting old buildings is hard. Don't I know it? You know that we have this feasibility plan for Massey that had sustainability as one of its core value. So we're still trying to get to the next step of doing it, not just having the feasibility study. So that's underway, but we'll need support from the community for that. Financial investment, financing is rigid and short supply. Intersectional activism on climate change and including social justice, but a diverse community able to meet and engage. So a role that we could play in bringing people together. Next slide. Intergenerational community, we know that. Mindful, responsible, try to be informed, if not intelligent, at least trying to be informed, ready to act, skilled, well-connected. I think we want to sustain that community's ability and deliberateness about the action on climate change. And I think, is there another slide, Alyssa? So environmental literacy, we talked about this, intergenerational advocacy, and use all non-recyclables that have emerged through COVID and be a better model, and support Indigenous land defenders through research and money. So let me go. I think I see that Akash, I think, is up, has something in the chat. Akash, do you want to say it loud?
Well, actually, no. I just thought I would just put it in, put it in the chat and sit quietly. Okay, I guess there are three things. I mean, we've talked about the first one, and that is the imperative to lead by example. Massey is an important intellectual center. As such, I think we're accustomed to projecting ideas, speaking about what we think is the right thing, and calling on society to act. But I think in general, but in climate change in particular, credibility is key. And credibility is measured not just by scientific expertise, but to the extent that there are sacrifices and changes that need to be made, a willingness of those who are calling on others to make those changes, to first live out those changes themselves. And we've talked about several of them already. You've listed some of them. But I would say that in making the case to the public, the first things out of our mouths has to be, what is it that we as an institution have done? I think the second thing is on public policy accountability. Again, historically, our college has had a very strong hand in developing public policy options that we've made available to decision makers and leaders in society. In truth, my sense of climate change is that the answers, though fiendishly difficult to implement, are not especially difficult to enumerate. The challenge has been that it has not even been that political actors have been unwilling to acknowledge the problem or unwilling to commit to solving the problem. It's that they have been unwilling to make the difficult decisions to actually implement those measures that there's a strong scientific consensus that we need to pursue. So from that perspective, I think that the greatest favor that we could do to our country's leadership is not telling them what they need to do, because they already know that. It's holding their feet to the fire when they don't do them. And that is a slightly more uncomfortable position for us as an institution, but there's no point in holding social and political capital if you don't spend it from time to time. I guess a third thing I'd suggest is, this comes through in everything that we do, but the intellectual and social imperative we have to bring together a variety of voices. And we've spoken about some of the voices that are often not part of public debate, from minority groups and racialized groups. But I think that there are also other voices that have been marginalized in the climate change debate that we often don't include in that category. Rural Canadians, farmers, people who have a very deep stake in answering the climate change challenge, but who are often not seen as such by society, and perhaps are most apt to be skeptical or resistant to change, precisely not because they care less, but because in the final analysis, they're being asked to sacrifice the most, and typically believe that others who have more are being asked to do less.
Yeah, good point. I see Anita is chiming in there. You can raise your hand. You know how to do the Zoom thing. You can raise your hand, or you can identify yourself in the chat. We're, really don't want to lose any ideas there. So, Anita.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here with you, and thank you for this wise counsel. Like Natalie, I feel very energized and excited about the ideas that you've brought forward in this wonderful report that you've all worked on, with just an extra ounce of thanks to those who produced it. I wanted just to ask perhaps our panelists or anyone in the conversation about the kind of intersection between Massey's opportunities to amplify the arts as a vehicle for cultivating trust and understanding, and amplifying the voices of those who we may not have heard, and so on. The arts as a centerpiece of our programming. I also wondered if we could also focus on the implications of adaptation to climate impact, in contrast to efforts to its mitigation. I don't mean to say that mitigation isn't important. Electrification, understanding and reducing carbon footprint, I absolutely understand that. But it's, I've been working with students on climate intensively, and many of the interventions that junior fellows and students see as accessible to them in the short run have to do with adapting our city and our communities to climate change, understood in the way that the Lieutenant Governor inspired us to think, as much more than only an environmental issue. So adaptation in terms of equity, adaptation in terms of the way we think and talk with each other and understand each other, the ways in which we collaborate, the ways in which we trust in science, the ways in which we do everything we do, the changes that we have to go through. And that almost always takes them the students, I mean, to a place where they both see changes that they would embrace and confront changes that they would find intolerable. And that leads to, I've learned, for me anyway, insights that can arise as to what is intolerable and how we might deal with that. It's a kind of complicated point. I'm sorry for that, but I'm thinking about the programming, Natalie, at the intersection of climate adaptation and the arts.
Yeah. Well, as you know, we've been wanting to do something more. So with the three arch of the programming when I arrived was going to be climate change, equality and justice, and the role of arts in our community, arts and community. Yeah. And you know, they almost cross over into each other's all the time. So I think there's a real way of that we could kind of frame that in different ways. And I hear also it goes back a little bit to Diane's ideas that, you know, we need to talk through what are the obstacles, what are the changes that are intolerable, and maybe the round room is the right place to do these circles to try to bring together people that don't see eye to eye or how to do the next steps, you know. Let me see, I think there's another message. Beth, do you want to jump in, Beth?
Sure. Thanks for all the great insights. It's really good to see from our colleagues and friends on the panel and hear what you had to say. I think that one of the things that Massey can do that's really critical, particularly for senior fellows, but especially for junior fellows, is help to maintain some hope. And one of the ways that it's very important, particularly for young people. And it's so easy to become discouraged and even despairing right now because climate is such an overwhelming issue. It's so challenging. Our progress has, even though those foundations might be crumbling, as John Robinson says, you know, it isn't always apparent until things tumble down and new really big changes take place. So by linking the things that can be accomplished locally, even though they may be difficult at Massey, you know, the physical infrastructure is difficult. I spent years trying to deal with those kinds of issues. It's tough. Food is less tough, but I think the carbon footprint of the college is very important. Using any funds at the college, not just to divest from carbon intensive, I think that's been done, but carbon intensive investments, but also to actively promote solutions with investments. And that's a more difficult thing, but something that can be accomplished, and where the junior and senior fellows and the quadrangulars can feel that they are participating in something positive that's local, that can be measured, and gives them a sense of hope and motivation to take on the larger global and national and provincial issues. So I think linking those two things is really important. And I think that it's those smaller, more concrete actions that individuals can undertake that help to create the attitudinal change. And this is something I've researched, that allow us to act on broader values in a much more global context. So I think that they have meaning not because they're going to have massive impacts on our Canadian contributions to climate disruption or the reverse, but because they help to motivate Canadians to do bigger things and to vote in different ways. So I really endorse the idea of Massey hosting a debate on climate. And I think we could take it farther. I was involved years ago in an initiative where environmental groups got together and actually identified a list of goals that we ourselves developed for what we thought the politicians should be doing and what they should commit to. And Massey, that'd be a great thing for Massey fellows to put together collectively. and not just invite people to answer questions, but say, will you commit? And we could do this beyond the leaders. We could do this for all the candidates and say, are you going to commit to these kinds of actions? We know they'll make a difference. We know they're in your jurisdiction and it's something you could do. And I can see Diane smiling, but I think that this is something that's relevant for all of the parties, especially since we might need some kind of coalition provincially in our next government. So the more individual candidates are going to commit and see the advantage in committing to these kinds of solutions, the better chance we will have after June of making a reasonable contribution in Ontario. And I agree about sprawl being our tar sands here in Ontario. So I think we do have really big opportunities to make a difference. Also, municipally, we could do something similar. You know, there have been some good steps made during the pandemic because we now realize the importance of the natural environment for all of our well-being, and bike lanes and reallocation of road space is part of that. But a lot of that has happened in the privileged downtown core. And when you look at the areas where most people live, when you look at the accommodation that most people occupy, which is apartments, when you look at the preponderance of where the short trips are being taken in Toronto, in the GTHA, it's not in the downtown area because most people live in the suburbs. Most people live in small apartments and they need to get out to access green space and they take short trips. Those short trips are not enabled right now.
Yeah.
And so there are real actions that need to be taken municipally, which are just another couple of steps along. And so not only could we promote that, I think, through some sort of engagement in asking for certain kinds of commitments on the part of candidates, but we could also host some of those small group sessions with municipal staff, for example. And cycling is one area that I'm familiar with where I know inequity is baked into the cycling plan. I mean, it's very conspicuous. There's a plan for the downtown and there's a plan for everywhere else. And everywhere else doesn't count, basically. So I think that there's a huge amount that Massey can do that links the intellectual heft and interdisciplinary spread of Massey as a real intellectual hub here in Ontario with concrete action that can provide hope, that can provide motivation, and make us feel like we're doing something. We're not just talking about it.
Cam, go ahead.
I mean, I've been reflecting on this conversation really over the last couple of weeks as we've been hosting events on the evolution of the conversation itself. And I remember the earliest that we talked about climate change at the time, we called it global warming, was when I was in the 5th grade. We had a school play, and at the time, the goal was raising awareness. That was the goal. And to see, number one, that we're still having that discussion. The goal is still raising awareness. And then to the Lieutenant Governor's point, I think we're just now starting to see, or at least come to a place where folks are accepting the fact that climate change is real and that we do need to take action. So as I reflect on that, I realize, it took a bit longer to raise awareness, or at least to convince everyone that it's legitimate, that we need to address it. I am humbled and inspired by what we can do and the progress that we can achieve when we put our mind to this. I think there's a lot that we can do both individually and in our communities. Here at Massey College, all these ideas have been popping in my head on top of what I submitted to the survey itself. Anything from solar panels on our rooftops to working on some landscaping that's more environmentally friendly, to how we're trying to minimize energy consumption too as well, right? I'm looking at the windows here at Massey and realizing, we could probably do some work there. But no, I'm thankful for the fact that we have the privilege to have this conversation and that we can take some change. But certainly to the points that have been raised, I think it starts with us individually and then collectively what we can do together.
So we started the Meatless Monday. So there's not a big, but at least it's a beginning. And as I say, we need to continue to identify clearly what are our carbon footprint, I think, is probably, I mean, we know about the building, but there's other things that we could look at. Amanda, you know, I see you there. Amanda and I have been talking about food and food waste for years. So
Oh my
it's
gosh,
nice
of
to see
course.
you.
Yes, I know you too. I've had my camera off just because of my little, I'm in a bit of a weird location, but it's so good to see familiar faces and also a couple of new ones. And yeah, thanks for bringing this topic and opening this meeting up to the community. There's been so many good ideas and so many great things said here. I think something I really appreciate about this, and just having been involved in the environmental group, so that's based on from junior fellows. So essentially, I think that's been a committee, a junior fellow committee at Massey over several years. But I really think this is so great to have, you know, like meetings and groups of like on the climate crisis involving all constituents of the college, because we're just so much powerful and better when we have, you know, different perspectives and, you know, multiple generations here. And I'm also so glad to hear, you know, also so glad that there's a lot of talk on multiple disciplines and bringing in the arts too. Because I think, just thinking of my time at Massey, when we've had discussions on the climate crisis, a lot of it's been science-based, which of course is, you know, really important and great. But I think, you know, we can branch and go even further, given it's a strength of Massey that we have people of so many disciplines. I guess one thing I will say here, maybe that hasn't been brought up quite yet, is I'm thinking, you know, keeping ways to ensure transparency and communicating to the community on, you know, what we're doing here, and even making transparent goals and saying, you know, these are our goals, like what have we achieved and like how far are we? And, you know, that can be both at the college level, whether it's, you know, things we're doing in the kitchen, you know, work on building efficiency, but also, you know, ways in which we're collaborating outside of the college community and, or, you know, educating within the community. And so we can keep track of those goals and see that we're moving forward and making progress. But I appreciate the mention of both, you know, thinking how can we reduce our carbon footprint and provide leadership at Massey, and then thinking more broadly of how can we make change that stems on broader levels.
So thank you, Amanda. So we're coming to the end of this hour, but it's not the end of this conversation. So we'd like to take a picture of the gallery here, just for safekeeping, to keep ourselves on track. I think we will do a little bit of a summary and a report on what some of the ideas, and try to sort of put together a little bit of an action plan. And we'll report back. I think it's a very important, lots of good ideas. I cannot thank you enough. And I want to thank particularly the Lieutenant Governor for being here. I know you have lots of other things on the go. I want to thank Diane, who also has lots of things on the go these days. And Rosemary, thank you very much, our diplomat in residence, showing leadership again. And thank you for all of you to have shared your thoughts and your energy. So let's keep going. I think it's important to draw on the strength of Massey, but also to ask ourselves to be accountable for this and other issues. Well, thank you, Alyssa. Thank you, all of you. And let's plan a next conversation and get down to business. Thank you.